In the heart of a billion-dollar empire, ruthless CEO Alexander Knight never cared for love, until he found Isabella Carter, a cleaning lady, asleep in his office restroom. What started as mere curiosity turned into an obsession, a passion, and a love so forbidden it threatened to destroy them both. The towering glass walls of Knight Enterprises gleamed under the city lights, standing as a symbol of wealth, power, and perfection. Inside, at the topmost floor, Alexander Knight sat behind his massive desk, drowning in reports and numbers. His office was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. It was past midnight, but the billionaire CEO was still there, because that's what he did. Work, building win. That was his entire life. Love, affection, those were just distractions. Tonight was no different. Except it was. Attention had been gnawing at him all day, a restless energy he couldn't shake. His once perfectly structured world felt off. Annoyed, he loosened his tie, exhaled sharply, and decided to take a short walk to clear his mind. That's when he found her. The executive restroom was empty, its floors shining under the soft glow of the LED lights. Alexander stepped inside, running a hand through his thick, dark hair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. And then he heard it. A soft, almost silent breathing. His sharp eyes followed the sound, leading him to the last stall. The door wasn't completely shut, and through the small gap, he saw a pair of delicate hands curled up beneath a mop bucket. A woman was asleep inside the stall. His first instinct was irritation. Who dared to fall asleep in his building? But as he stepped closer, his gaze softened. She wasn't just sleeping. She was exhausted, completely worn out, curled up on the cold floor as if she had no other choice. Her breathing was slow, her eyelashes fluttering slightly, her face resting against her arm. She looked fragile, vulnerable. Something unfamiliar stirred inside him. He wasn't used to feeling anything for anyone. But right now, standing there, looking at this woman sleeping so soundly, he felt an unexplainable tightness in his chest. Alexander wasn't a man of hesitation. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the silent restroom. The woman stirred, her eyelashes fluttered, and she gasped, startled awake. For a moment their eyes met, deep brown eyes locked onto piercing blue ones. Panic washed over her face as she scrambled to sit up. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice hushed and shaky. I'm so sorry, She stumbled, struggling to get up. Her hands were shaking, and in her rush, she knocked over the mop bucket, sending water splashing onto the floor. Alexander remained still, his eyes locked onto her. She was young, probably in her mid-20s. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her delicate face. Her uniform was wrinkled from sleeping in it, and her cheeks burned with embarrassment. I wasn't sleeping, she lied quickly, eyes darting around, trying to clean up the mess she had made. I was just resting for a second. She bit her lip, as if realizing how foolish her excuse sounded. Alexander still hadn't spoken. That made her even more nervous. Finally, he tilted his head slightly, his icy blue eyes unreadable. "You fell asleep on the floor of a restroom." Her breath hitched. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was something else entirely. Concern? Number. That couldn't be. Men like him didn't care about women like her. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, looking down. I was working a double shift, and my break was only 15 minutes. She swallowed hard. "I won't let it happen again, sir. Please don't fire me." Fire her? The thought seemed absurd to him now. Alexander took a step closer. She stiffened. A part of him found it fascinating, the way she was so small compared to him, yet she held herself with quiet strength. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice deep and smooth. She hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "Isabella. Isabella Carter, Isabella." The name felt strangely perfect on his tongue. He studied her for another long moment before speaking again. "Get some rest. Just don't let anyone else catch you." Her eyes widened. Then, before she could say another word, Alexander turned and walked away, leaving behind a woman who had never felt more shocked, confused, and breathless in her entire life. Isabella stood frozen in place, her heart pounding wildly. What had just happened? The Alexander Knight, the untouchable billionaire CEO, had found her sleeping on the job, and he didn't fire her? Instead, he let her go. She didn't know why, but something about the way he had looked at her in that moment made her stomach twist. Not in fear, but in something dangerously close to attraction. Number, she couldn't afford to think like that. Not about him. With a shaky breath, she bent down, picked up the mop, and forced herself to forget that moment ever happened. What she didn't know was that, across the hall, in his office, Alexander Knight was leaning against his desk, staring out the window, still thinking about the girl he had just walked away from. And for the first time in a very, very long time, he felt something he couldn't explain. Alexander Knight was a man of logic, control, precision, absolute focus. But for the first time in years, he found his thoughts unfocused. Seated behind his polished mahogany desk, he stared at the endless contracts in front of him. The board of directors wanted answers. Investors were expecting updates. Every detail of his billion-dollar empire depended on his decision-making. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Isabella Carter, the cleaning lady he had caught sleeping on the restroom floor last night. He had never spared a second thought for anyone outside of his business circle before. He had seen employees come and go, their faces nothing but background noise in his world of wealth and power. So why did his mind keep drifting back to her? He could still see her startled brown eyes, the way her cheeks flushed in embarrassment, the way her delicate hands trembled as she tried to clean up her spilled water. More than that, he remembered how small she had looked, curled up on the cold, hard floor, exhausted, overworked, invisible to the rest of the world, not to him. And that was what unsettled him the most. Shaking his head, Alexander tried to dismiss the thoughts. He had more important things to do than waste time on a janitor. But by noon, he found himself checking his office again, half expecting to hear the soft rustling of her mop bucket outside his door. She wasn't there. Annoyed with himself, he scrolled through the intercom system and pressed a button. "Lisa," he called his assistant. "Yes, Mr. Knight?" His voice was calm, controlled. "Who is in charge of the janitorial staff in this building?" There was a brief silence, then Lisa responded, surprised by his question. "I believe their shift supervisor is Mr. Harris. Do you need me to set up a meeting?" Alexander hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "No." Then, after a beat, "Find out when Isabella Carter is assigned to my office." Lisa paused. "Isabella Carter?" "Yes," he said flatly. "The cleaning lady." Another pause, then a quick, "Of course, sir." "Right away." As he hung up, Alexander leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. What the hell was he doing? "You're assigned to Mr. Knight's office." Isabella blinked in shock as her shift supervisor handed her a new cleaning schedule. Mr. Knight," she repeated. "The CEO," Mr. Harris said, adjusting his glasses. "He specifically requested that you handle his office from now on." Her stomach twisted in confusion. Why would he? Was this punishment? Had he changed his mind about firing her? Panic surged through her chest. If she got fired, she wouldn't just lose her job, she would lose her ability to take care of her mother and her younger brother. Swallowing hard, she forced her voice to remain steady. "Is there a reason why he made this request?" Her supervisor shrugged. "No clue, but I'd suggest you don't keep him waiting." Isabella stood outside his office, gripping her cleaning supplies like a lifeline. Her heart was hammering inside her chest. The last time she had seen Alexander Knight, he had caught her sleeping on the restroom floor like a fool. And now she was about to walk into his private space, a place probably worth more than everything she had ever owned in her life. Steeling herself, she knocked lightly. "Enter," came the deep, smooth voice from inside. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and froze. His office was breathtakingly luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a panoramic view of the city, casting golden sunlight over sleek black furniture, glass panels, and pristine white marble floors. And in the middle of it all, he sat, Alexander Knight. Impossibly handsome, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his blue eyes locked on her the second she walked in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You're late." Isabella stiffened. His tone was calm yet commanding, making her feel small but not unworthy. I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "It won't happen again." She hurried to set up her supplies, but she could feel his piercing gaze following her every move. Her hands trembled as she reached for a duster. Why was she so nervous? She had cleaned hundreds of offices before. Why did this feel so different? Alexander wasn't sure why he had asked her to clean his office. He had tried to rationalize it, convincing himself that he simply preferred order. And if she was going to be in his building, she should at least do it under his supervision. But as he watched her quietly work, her movements careful and precise, he knew the truth. He wanted her here. Close enough for him to study. Close enough to figure out why she made him feel this strange pull in his chest. She wiped down the bookshelves, her delicate fingers tracing over the polished wood, before moving to his desk. When she reached for his paperweight, her hand brushed against his wrist. The touch was accidental, fleeting and barely there, but he felt it like a shock through his body. Isabella snatched her hand back, her breath hitching. "Sorry," she whispered. Alexander didn't move. His eyes dropped to her fingers before flicking back up to her face. For the briefest moment, an unspoken tension filled the room, something heavier than air, stronger than words. Then, in his usual calm voice, he said, "Careful." Isabella nodded quickly and went back to cleaning, but neither of them could ignore it. That single touch, that single moment. Something had changed between them, something that neither of them was ready to name. The sky had turned a deep shade of grey by the time Isabella finished her shift. Thick clouds loomed over the towering skyline, casting eerie shadows over the city. A sudden gust of wind swept through the streets, rustling leaves and sending shivers down her spine. She sighed. Of course, just her luck. Glancing at her wristwatch, she realised she had missed the last bus home. She had been too busy scrubbing every corner of Alexander Knight's office, trying to suppress the strange, fluttering sensation in her chest whenever his eyes landed on her. For the past week, he had been watching her, not in an overbearing, uncomfortable way, but in a manner that made her heart race. She wasn't used to attention, especially not from a man like him, a man who could have any woman he wanted, yet for some reason his gaze kept returning to her. And that terrified her. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and started walking down the sidewalk, hoping to beat the rain before it poured. She didn't make it far. A few minutes in, the sky roared, and within seconds, cold raindrops started pelting down mercilessly. She gasped as the icy water drenched her thin coat, soaking through to her skin. "Damn it," she muttered, hugging herself and quickening her steps. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few rushing pedestrians, taxis speeding past, and a sleek black car that slowed down beside her. She barely had time to register the familiar vehicle before the tinted window rolled down. And there he was, Alexander Knight. "Get in." His voice was low, smooth, commanding. Isabella stood frozen, rain dripping from her hair, her coat plastered to her body. She should say no. She shouldn't step into that car. Because once she did, there would be no turning back. She looked up at him, her teeth slightly chattering from the cold. His gaze was unreadable, intense, piercing, almost impatient. She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I'll be fine. It's just rain." Alexander exhaled, clearly not in the mood for her stubbornness. "You're soaked," he stated flatly. She let out a short, breathless laugh. "Yeah, well, water doesn't kill people." His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, his jaw tightening. And then he said it. "Isabella, get in the damn car." Her breath caught in her throat. The way he said her name, firm yet laced with something softer, something dangerous, sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She shouldn't. She really, really shouldn't. But her frozen body refused to argue. With a sigh, she hurried into the car, slamming the door shut behind her. The interior of the car was warm, expensive, and smelled faintly of him. A rich, masculine scent that made her stomach flip. She kept her eyes on her lap, too aware of his presence beside her. Alexander said nothing at first. He simply reached over, grabbed a handkerchief from the console, and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it. "Thank you," she murmured, dabbing her wet face carefully. He nodded, but didn't look at her. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, guiding the car through the rain-slicked streets. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Isabella cleared her throat. "You really didn't have to do this, you know." "You were walking in a storm," he said simply. "You could have gotten sick." She let out a small chuckle. "So? A billionaire like you worrying about a janitor catching a cold? Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. She sighed, tilting her head to watch the rain trickle down the car window. "I don't get you," she admitted softly. Alexander's grip on the wheel tightened just slightly. "What do you mean?" "You," she said, finally turning to look at him. "You're supposed to be cold, heartless, the kind of man who doesn't care about people like me. But then..." She bit her lip, searching for the right words. "Then what?" he pressed, his deep blue eyes dangerously unreadable. "Then you do things like this," she whispered. "You let me sleep in that restroom without firing me. You watch me while I work. And now, you're here, giving me a ride home." The words hung between them, heavy with something unspoken, something neither of them were ready to name. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He simply stared ahead, his expression unreadable, as if he himself didn't have an answer to her question. Finally, in a quiet voice, he said, "Maybe I don't understand myself either." They arrived at her apartment far too quickly. Isabella reached for the door handle, eager to escape before she said something even more stupid. But before she could step out, Alexander's deep voice stopped her. "Wait." She froze. He was watching her now. Really watching her, his piercing blue gaze locked onto hers, searching, questioning, feeling. And then he did something that made her heart stop beating altogether. He reached out, slowly, carefully, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a jolt of warmth through her entire body. Her breath hitched. His eyes flickered to her lips for just a second. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop him. But then, he pulled away. "Stay out of the rain next time," he murmured, his voice lower, rougher. Isabella nodded, dazed, her pulse racing. And with that, she stepped out of the car, shutting the door behind her before she could do something reckless, like kiss a man she had no business wanting. As she disappeared inside her apartment building, Alexander remained in the car, staring at the raindrops trailing down the windshield. His fingers still tingled from where he had touched her. What the hell was he doing? With a frustrated sigh, he ran a hand through his hair and sped off into the stormy night. But he already knew the truth. She was getting under his skin, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Alexander Knight was not a man who lost sleep over trivial matters. His world was built on control, logic, and order, qualities that had made him one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. And yet, last night, after dropping Isabella off at her apartment, he had spent hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling. He could still feel the ghost of her warm skin beneath his fingertips, the delicate curve of her ear as he tucked her hair back, the way her lips had parted slightly, as if she had been waiting for him to kiss her. Damn it. He shut his laptop with an irritated sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to forget her. Instead, she was infiltrating his every thought, and he had no idea how to make it stop. And the worst part, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to stop. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to drown himself in work and push her out of his mind. But when he stepped onto the executive floor, the first thing he saw was her. Isabella Carter, standing near the hallway, laughing softly as she spoke to another man. His chest tightened. The man in question was Daniel Reed, one of his company's younger executives. Charming, ambitious, and notorious for flirting with every woman in the building. And right now, Daniel's attention was fully on Isabella. Alexander's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Daniel was standing far too close to her, his body leaning slightly forward in a way that suggested interest. Isabella, on the other hand, looked slightly amused, shaking her head at something Daniel said. She wasn't flirting back, but she also wasn't walking away. A sharp, unfamiliar sensation twisted in Alexander's stomach. Something dark, something possessive, jealousy. It was a ridiculous emotion beneath him, yet here he was, gripping his briefcase so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't like it. He hated it. And he hated the fact that Isabella was the one making him feel this way. Isabella. His voice cut through the conversation like a blade, deep and commanding. Daniel immediately straightened, his easygoing expression shifting into one of respect and slight nervousness. "Mr. Knight," he greeted. Isabella turned, her brown eyes widening slightly when she saw him. "Sir," she said, her voice softer, uncertain. Alexander didn't look at Daniel. His eyes were on her. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Isabella blinked, looking back at Daniel hesitantly before nodding. "Oh, okay." She hurried after him as he turned and strode toward his office, his jaw tightly clenched. Once inside, he shut the door behind her, a little too forcefully. She flinched slightly, shifting on her feet. "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to his desk, setting his briefcase down before turning to her, his gaze dark and unreadable. "Do you like him?" he asked. Her brows furrowed. "What?" "Daniel Reed." His tone was flat, dangerous in its calmness. "Do you like him?" She blinked at him, completely caught off guard. "He's nice, I guess." His jaw tightened. Nice. Was that what she wanted? Someone nice? The thought unsettled him more than it should have. "He's a flirt," Alexander said, his voice sharper than intended. "He doesn't care about anyone but himself." Isabella frowned, crossing her arms. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Knight." Alexander let out a humorless chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sure you can." Silence stretched between them, tense, heavy, and then, softly. "Why do you care?" Alexander stilled. His blue eyes flickered to hers, searching, questioning. She was standing there, in her simple uniform, her dark curls slightly damp from the morning mist, her lips slightly parted as she waited for his answer. Why did he care? Because she was his? She didn't know it yet. Hell, he hadn't fully accepted it either. But the thought of another man touching her, laughing with her, having her attention, it made his blood boil in a way that nothing ever had before. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. Isabella's breath caught. He noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly, the way her heartbeat seemed to stutter in her chest. She felt it too. This pull, this electricity between them. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I don't want him near you." Her eyes widened. He was too close now, so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, her mind screaming at her to step back. But her body? Her body refused to move. "Alexander," she whispered, not even realizing she had used his first name for the first time. Something in his eyes darkened. She had never said his name before. He liked it. Too much. "Do you know how infuriating you are?" he murmured, his fingers twitching at his sides as if restraining himself. Her lips parted, her breath uneven. A knock on the door shattered the moment. They both jolted, stepping back as if they had been caught doing something forbidden. Alexander exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "Come in," he said, his voice colder than before. His assistant walked in with a stack of reports, oblivious to the tension in the room. Alexander barely acknowledged her. His attention was still on Isabella. She took a small step back, lowering her gaze. "I should get back to work," she mumbled. He clenched his jaw but nodded. As she turned to leave, he called out, "Isabella." She paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. His expression was unreadable, his blue eyes stormy and intense. "I meant what I said." Her fingers curled at her sides. Without another word, she walked out, leaving behind a man who was slowly coming to terms with the dangerous truth. He was falling for her, and he had no idea how to stop it. For days after their last encounter, Alexander Knight felt like a man on the edge of something dangerous. A man who had spent his life keeping emotions at bay, maintaining control, and never letting anyone get too close. But Isabella Carter was ruining everything. Ever since the moment she had whispered his first name, since the way her brown eyes had locked onto his with something too close to longing, he hadn't been able to think straight. His business meetings became background noise. His work felt meaningless. All because of her. And it was a problem. A very big problem. Because men like him did not fall for women like her. And society was about to remind him of that. It started with a single rumour. Alexander had known that people were watching him closely. Every step he took, every decision he made was analysed, criticised, and picked apart by the media, by his business partners, by those who wanted to see him fail. But what he hadn't expected was for those same people to turn their attention to her. The whispers started among his employees, the cleaning lady who had caught the CEO's eye. Then his board members started noticing. And soon it wasn't just whispers anymore. It was full-blown speculation. Alexander Knight is spending an unusual amount of time in his office these days. Have you seen the way he looks at her? She's nothing but a gold digger just waiting for the right moment to trap him. The words made his blood boil. But the worst part? Isabella heard every single one of them. The staff lounge was nearly empty when Isabella walked in, her hands gripping her cleaning supplies tightly. She wasn't supposed to care what people said. She wasn't supposed to let it get to her. But today she had heard something that cut deeper than anything ever had before. "She's just another social climber," a sharp female voice had whispered in the hallway. "She knows exactly what she's doing. Sleeping her way to the top, just wait. In a few months, she'll be dripping in diamonds." Laughter. Cruel. Heartless. And it had killed something inside her, because no matter how much she tried to deny it, she had felt something for Alexander. Something terrifyingly real. And now she was nothing but a joke in the eyes of the world. A nobody who had dared to be noticed by a man far beyond her reach. He knew something was wrong the moment he saw her. Isabella had always carried herself with a quiet strength, a resilience that made her stand out even in the most invisible of jobs. But today she looked defeated. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes downcast, her movements lacking the warmth he had come to crave from her. And he hated it. He hated that something had dimmed her light. He hated that he had been too distracted to protect her from it. "Isabella," he called, his voice softer than usual. She stiffened at the sound of his voice, then slowly turned. For a moment she hesitated, as if unsure whether to face him or run. Then she forced a smile. "Yes, Mr. Knight?" He frowned. Mr. Knight. Not Alexander, not even Sir, just a cold, formal acknowledgement. And he knew. Something had changed. "Come to my office," he said. "Now." The moment the door shut behind them, Isabella let out a quiet breath. Alexander crossed his arms, leaning against his desk, watching her carefully. "Tell me what happened," he said. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Nothing," she said too quickly, too stiffly. His jaw tightened. "Don't lie to me," he warned. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Does it even matter?" "To me." He took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. "Yes." She swallowed hard, willing herself to stay strong, to not break in front of him. "It's not just about me, Alexander," she finally whispered. "It's about you, about how people see you, about how they see this." He stilled. "You think I care what people say?" "You should," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "You run an empire. You have a reputation to uphold, and I—" She let out a breath, shaking her head. "I can't be the reason you lose it all." His eyes darkened dangerously. "Who put that thought in your head?" She looked away. "I overheard the board members talking." Something sharp and violent flashed across his face. "And you believe them?" he asked, his voice low, borderline lethal. Her throat tightened. "It doesn't matter what I believe," she whispered. "What matters is that this, whatever this is, can't happen." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Isabella." "No," she cut him off. "I can't do this. I won't." A silence thicker than steel settled between them. And then, finally, with a broken whisper, "I quit." Alexander felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath him. "You what?" His voice came out sharper than intended, edged with something dangerously close to panic. "I quit," she repeated, her voice softer but no less certain. His chest tightened painfully. She was leaving him. He should stop her. He should say something, anything, everything to make her stay. But for the first time in his life, he didn't know how. She turned to leave. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to pull her back. But he didn't. Instead, he watched as she walked away, taking something vital, something irreplaceable with her. And when the door finally closed behind her, leaving him alone in his office, he realized the brutal, agonizing truth. He had just lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The moment Isabella walked out of his office, Alexander Knight felt something inside him crack open. He had been through multi-million-dollar losses, failed business acquisitions, and betrayals from people he trusted. But none of it, nothing in his entire existence, had ever felt like this. Like an aching emptiness settling in his chest, clawing at him from the inside. Like he had lost something irreplaceable. For the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it, and that terrified him. Alexander didn't sleep that night, or the next. He stayed late in his office, waiting, hoping that maybe she would come back. That she would walk through those doors and tell him this was all some horrible mistake. But she never did. He tried to focus on work, drowning himself in meetings and numbers, but everything felt meaningless. The moment Isabella left, his world lost its colour. Even the smallest things felt wrong. His coffee tasted bitter despite being made the same way. His penthouse felt empty despite its luxury. His office, once a place of power and control, felt cold, hollow, because she was no longer there. And he couldn't stand it. Alexander wasn't a man who let things go. And he wasn't about to start now. The day after Isabella left, he made one phone call. Then another. Then another. But every lead came up empty. She had resigned from the janitorial company immediately after quitting his office, cutting off all ties. No one knew where she had gone. No one had seen her since. It was as if she had vanished. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Knight, the man who could control everything, was completely, utterly powerless. Lisa, his assistant, noticed the change in him first. The once unshakable billionaire was now a man who barely spoke, his usual sharp efficiency replaced with restless irritation. Meetings were cut short, phone calls were ignored. And most telling of all, he no longer cared about winning. Because what was the point? What was the point of success, power and wealth when the only thing that had ever truly made him feel alive was gone. "You're not yourself," Lisa finally said one afternoon. "Something's wrong." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Nothing is wrong," he muttered. Lisa sighed, crossing her arms. "Sir, with all due respect, you haven't been the same since Isabella left." His entire body stiffened. Her name. Even just hearing it hurt. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. "Find her," she said gently. "If she matters this much, go after her." Alexander exhaled slowly. His pride told him to let it go, but his heart, the one thing he had ignored all these years, was screaming at him to fight. And Alexander had never backed down from a fight before. It took him 3 days. 3 days of searching. 3 days of calling in every favor, using every resource. Until finally, he found her. She had taken a temporary job at a small interior design studio. A humble place in a quiet part of town. The irony almost made him smile. Even after everything, she was still chasing her dream. She hadn't taken the easy way out. She hadn't tried to use him for money. She had simply left. And the thought of her believing she was never worthy enough for him made his chest tighten painfully. He wasn't going to let this end like this. He refused. So he did the one thing he had never done before. He went after her. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Isabella walked out of the studio, exhausted from another long shift. The moment she stepped outside, she froze. Because there, leaning against a sleek black car, was him, Alexander Knight. The man she had tried to forget. The man she had loved in silence. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Alexander?" He straightened, pushing off the car and walking toward her with slow, determined steps. There was something different about him. His usual confidence was still there, but beneath it, there was something raw, something vulnerable, something that made her breath hitch. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. He stopped right in front of her, his blue eyes stormy, filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I came for you," he said, his voice low, rough. Her pulse skipped a beat. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Number you shouldn't have left." She flinched at his words. "I had to." "Why?" His voice was almost desperate now. "Because of what people said. Because of what they think." She clenched her fists. "Because it's the truth, Alexander. We live in different worlds. You belong with people like you. Women who fit your world, your status. Not me." A silence. Then, in a voice so quiet, so filled with undeniable truth, he said, "I don't care about any of that. The only thing I care about is you." Isabella sucked in a breath. Her lips parted, her heart pounding uncontrollably. "Don't do this," she whispered, shaking her head. "Don't make this harder than it already is." But Alexander stepped closer, and when he spoke next, his voice shattered everything she had tried so hard to convince herself of. "I don't care if the world doesn't approve. I don't care if I have to walk away from my reputation, my fortune, my entire empire. None of it matters without you." Tears burned in Isabella's eyes. She had spent so long believing she wasn't enough, but here he was, the most powerful man she had ever known, telling her that she was all he needed. His gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw it. Love. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable love shining in his ocean blue eyes. "Come back to me," he murmured, his voice a plea. "Don't run from this. From us." And that was it. That was all it took. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she collapsed into his arms, her fingers clutching his suit, her heart finally letting go of the fear. Because the truth was, she had never stopped wanting him. And maybe, just maybe, she never would. Isabella didn't know how long she stood there, wrapped in Alexander's arms, as the world around them blurred into nothingness. All she knew was that his warmth surrounded her, his heart beating steadily against her cheek, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. But safety was a dangerous thing. because safety made her want to stay, and she knew, if she stayed, she would never be able to leave him again. Her hands trembled as she pulled back slightly, her brown eyes filled with emotions she couldn't name. Alexander. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing against her cheek, wiping away the tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I mean it, Isabella," he murmured, his voice deep, steady, and filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I don't care about the world. I don't care what people say. The only thing I care about is you." Her heart shattered and healed all at once. But still the doubt, the fear lingered. "You say that now," she whispered, her voice fragile, uncertain. "But what happens when the rumors get worse? When your family, your business partners, your investors start questioning your decisions because of me? What then, Alexander?" He exhaled, his jaw tightening as he realized the weight she had been carrying alone all this time. She had been protecting him, even at the cost of her own happiness, and that realization broke him. "I don't care about my business," he said, his voice raw. "Not if it means losing you." She shook her head, trying to pull away, but he wouldn't let her. "I'm serious, Isabella," he pressed. "I have spent my whole life chasing things that never mattered. Power, control, money. But you are the only thing I have ever truly wanted." Her breath hitched. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his voice a whisper of truth against her lips. "If I have to burn my entire empire to the ground just to be with you, I will." Tears slipped down her cheeks. No one had ever fought for her before. No one had ever wanted her the way he did. But still she hesitated. "Alexander, I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." His gaze softened. "Then be the reason I have everything." And before she could say another word, his lips crashed into hers. The moment his lips met hers, the world fell apart. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a confession, a plea, a promise all in one. He kissed her like he was starving for her, like he had spent every second of his life waiting for this moment. And now that he had it, he refused to let go. Isabella gasped against his mouth, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as if she were terrified he might disappear. But he didn't. He was right there, holding her tighter, pulling her closer, like she was the only thing keeping him alive. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and a soft moan escaped her lips, completely lost in the way he made her feel. But then, reality crashed back in. She pulled away, gasping for air, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break. Alexander's eyes were dark, wild, desperate as he watched her, his breath heavy. But she stepped back, shaking her head. His expression shifted instantly, a flicker of panic, of fear. "Don't," he murmured, taking a step toward her, but she took another step back. This is dangerous, Alexander," she whispered, pressing a trembling hand to her lips, still swollen from his kiss. "You're right," he agreed, his voice rough. "It is dangerous, because it's real." She exhaled shakily, fighting the emotions clawing at her chest. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to love someone like you." He let out a soft, almost broken laugh. "Then let me show you." Isabella had spent her whole life believing she wasn't enough, that she was too ordinary for a love story like this, but standing here in front of Alexander Knight, a man who had everything yet still chose her, she realized something. Maybe she was enough. Maybe she had been enough all along. She lifted her gaze to meet his. There was so much love in his eyes. Love that terrified her, love that made her want to run, love that made her want to stay. And suddenly the choice wasn't so hard anymore. She took a deep breath and whispered the words that changed everything. "Show me then." Alexander's breath caught. For a moment it was as if time stood still. Then his lips curled into a slow, breathtaking smile. And without another word he pulled her back into his arms, kissing her again, this time softer, slower, deeper. like he had all the time in the world. Because for the first time, he did. For the first time in her life, Isabella Carter wasn't running away. Wasn't. She had spent weeks convincing herself that she and Alexander could never be, that love between a billionaire CEO and a cleaning lady was nothing but a fantasy. But standing here, wrapped in his arms, his lips pressing against her forehead as if she were the most precious thing in the world, she realized something. She had never been more wrong, because he had chosen her. Against his wealth, his status, the expectations of his world, he had chosen her. And for the first time, she chose him too. Not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, but because he was hers. But loving Alexander Knight wasn't going to be easy. She learned that the very next morning when the world found out about them. News broke fast. The media was ruthless. Billionaire CEO Alexander Knight, spotted with former cleaning lady. Is this a real love story or a scandal? Was she the reason he's been losing focus at work? A Cinderella fairy tale or a gold digger's dream come true? The headlines were merciless, and the whispers at his company only grew louder. Isabella had expected Alexander to pull away, to regret fighting for her. But instead he did something she never saw coming. He held her hand in public, right in the middle of a crowded event. He didn't care about the flashing cameras, the judging stares. He simply laced their fingers together, looked at her and said, "They don't matter, only you do." And that was the moment Isabella truly, completely fell in love. A week later, Alexander called her into his office. But this time it wasn't for work. When she walked in, his entire office had been transformed. Instead of cold, professional elegance, it was filled with her dreams. Design samples, sketches, blueprints of a brand new luxury hotel. And her name was on them. Isabella Carter, lead designer. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to Alexander, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? What is this?" she whispered. He stepped closer, watching her with that intense, unwavering gaze. "This is yours," he said softly. "A chance to prove that you're not just a woman I love, but a woman who deserves to be in my world." Tears filled her eyes. He wasn't just giving her a title. He was giving her respect, a future, a career built on her own talent, not his wealth. But then, he did something that made her heart stop. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was a ring, a simple, elegant diamond, not extravagant, not overwhelming, just perfect. Her breath hitched. He wasn't kneeling, he wasn't making a grand gesture. Instead, he simply looked at her, holding the ring between his fingers as he whispered, "I'm not asking you to marry me right now. I'm asking you to believe that this is real." A sob broke from her lips, because this was the realest thing she had ever known. Tears spilling, she took the ring from his fingers and slipped it onto her own hand. Her answer was clear. She was his, and he was hers, forever. Months later, Isabella stood in the center of a breathtaking ballroom, surrounded by luxury and elegance. But this time, she wasn't just the cleaning lady. She was the lead designer of one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in the country. She had built this, not as Alexander Knight's fiancée, not as the woman the world had doubted, but as a woman who had earned her place. And as she turned, locking eyes with the love of her life, she knew